Hello, everyone. My name is Jillian Cobb, and I am excited to welcome you to today's Meet the Author with Eva Hagberg for the book When Eero Met His Match. This program is being recorded, so you will be getting a follow-up link from me probably in a week or so you can rewatch this all over again. So a little bit about the book. Provides a new understanding of post-war architectural history in the United States. When Eero Met His Match is both a poignant love story and a superb biographical study that challenges us to reconsider the relationship between fame and media representation and the ways the narratives of others can become our own. I'm excited to introduce our author today. Eva Hagberg is a writer and historian based in Los Angeles. Her books include When Eero Met His Match and How to Be Loved. She has a PhD in visual and narrative culture from UC Berkeley and teaches at Columbia, GSAPP, and Bard College. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of today's program, so make sure to put your questions in the Q&A feature that you see on your screen. So with that, I will pass things over to Eva.
Amazing. Okay, can you hear me? I'm like always paranoid with it. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for having me, Jillian. Thank you to the Nordic Museum. And thanks to everybody who's here. It's always a little bit weird. I'm just talking to myself, but I assume that you're all there and you're smiling and you're laughing and you're very excited about this. So I am gonna sorry, I need to disable seeing myself. Okay, 1 second. Let me figure this out. Okay. I think great, much better. So I love that introduction to the book. And I think also what it omits is just how thirsty the love letters are. Eero Saarinen, I want to thank Jillian, I want to thank the museum, and I also want to thank Eero Saarinen for writing some incredible love letters, which is really what has brought us here today. My book is called When Eero Met His Match. It has its roots in my dissertation at UC Berkeley in visual and narrative culture. I made up that PhD program because I was really, really interested in the relationship between images and text and the way in which they begin to have conversations with each other, the way in which we talk about pictures and that makes us draw differently. And then we talk about that drawing and then we write differently. And sort of that iterative relationship is really, really interesting to me. But I'm here to tell you about Aline Luchheim Saarinen. So this is her with a gigantic snake, which I think kind of gives a great understanding and an overview of what she's like. When she met Eero, she was an associate art critic for the New York Times. She was writing about architecture. She was very attuned to Scandinavian architecture. She was a big fan of Aalto. She'd actually written about Eero Saarinen in 1948 before they met, when he won the competition for the St. Louis Arch. So she was this incredibly successful, at that time she was single. She was this single successful art critic writing about architecture, writing about art for the New York Times, clearly very unafraid of scary things like this snake. And she frequently wrote about museum shows. She wrote about architectural news. What I love about being a historian is that I see how many things repeat themselves. So in 2023, a lot of writers now are saying there's no good writers about architecture. There's no good publications. There's no good magazines. Everything is ending. Everything used to be great and now it's terrible. And in the 1950s, everybody was saying there are no good magazines. All the good writers are gone. Everything is terrible. So that was the milieu in which she was working. What I say as a historian is that this was the golden age of publishing. The 1950s, there were a lot of magazines. There were 4 major architectural magazines, as well as the New York Times, that were covering architecture regularly. So it was a pretty exciting time for her to be working. This is from a birthday card that she produced for his, I think, 51st, 52nd birthday. And I just love this image. It shows the way in which they used imagery together. It's diagrammatic. I work a lot on sort of documents as objects. I'm very interested in how they're put together. And she says Friday, July 17th, 1953, and all the next golden days and nights until August 5th, 1953. And it was during that most unbelievable and wonderful and beautiful and perfect time that we became spiritually married, henceforth to be husband and wife. So he was married when they met. And I should actually tell you how they met. So she's working for the New York Times, and she gets this assignment to go to Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, where Eero Saarinen has set up his firm. He was working with his father, and then they actually split when they both competed to become the architects of the new St. Louis Arch, and Eero won. So the conceit of the piece was going to be somebody writing about how Eero was really kind of superseding Eliel, his father. So she gets this assignment. She flies out to Bloomfield Hills, and they have an interview. And then the records show very clearly that they're driving somewhere, and they turn a corner in the car, and somebody takes somebody else's hand. And within a couple of hours, they have consummated their love, possibly in a coat closet. It's unclear, but basically they got together. And this was very scandalous because she was writing about him for the New York Times. If any of you are journalists, I'm sure you know that, sleeping with your subject the first day that you meet them is usually not recommended for journalistic objectivity. And also he was married, and he had 2 children, and he had a very sort of set family life. She went back to New York, and they started writing each other letters. And this is where I really got interested as a historian of the media and as a historian of architecture. She actually shared drafts with him. So she sent him a draft of her story, which is completely not allowed ever. And she asked for his feedback. And there's this amazing document where he goes point by point through the article. And some of his corrections are really straightforward. Some of them are very flirtatious. He says at one point, you got this wrong. That's 2 Spanx for you. So I was really interested in this interplay of the professional and the personal. So professionally, he says, well, my office started at this point, and you need to mention this other architect. And also, my wife's name is Lily, and my children's names are Susan and Eric. And then it really flips into flirtation and personal enthusiasm. So I just thought, like, this is wild. This is a wild archive. And I want to work on it. And I'm always interested in the autobiographical. Part of this book is autobiographical. I write about my own career as a high-end publicist for clients. So I did Aleen's job, but not to people I was married to, although that is sort of changing now. I'm not marrying all my clients, just to be clear. But I was really, I was in a relationship. I was newly in a relationship when I came across this archive, and I'm always very kind of extra in the beginning, and I don't have a lot of like self-regulation, and I just sort of go really hard. And I remember reading their early letters and thinking, okay, well, they're going really hard, so I can go really hard. It sort of gave me permission from, across the centuries, which was great. And it, honestly, it motivated me to keep developing the kind of necessary academic rigor to do this project, because I also wanted to do a really good, really serious work of history while also soothing myself for being a little bit of like a hyper girlfriend. So, okay, what does any of this have to do with, the Nordic Museum? What does this have to do with anything? Well, it has to do with Eero Saarinen, Finnish-American architect, born 1910 in Finland. This is the St. Louis Arch. It was initially designed in 1948. It was completed, I should know this, I believe after, I actually don't know when it was finished. Okay, TBD, I'll look that up. Much, much, much later. It's an astonishing work of architecture. I was going to say astonishing building, debatable whether it's a building. You can go inside it. I was too scared to go into the elevators, which are very, very, very tiny, but you take them up the sides and you can go to the top and look out over St. Louis. He was really somebody who was interested in form. The way that he considered form was extremely unusual at the time. He was making curvy structures. He was very interested in what he called the sort of humanistic organic style. he really saw his architecture not necessarily as monumental, even though that is how it has been read, but as deeply human. He was interested in the person's encounter with the space and what it would feel like to go inside somewhere. And we'll look at TWA later. That was really sort of an encapsulation of his approach to this. But he was born in Finland. He came to America. He worked with his father, Eliel Saarinen. And as I said, in 1948, sort of split off to do his own thing. And had he not done that, he and Elaine would never have met. So this is, again, I am really interested in looking at these documents as a visual object. So this is an envelope. It's a letter that was sent February 11th, 1953. So they had just met. She had just gone to Bloomfield Hills. I believe that the contents of this letter, actually I have it here. So I'll tell you what it is. But what I'm interested in here are these sort of layers of information. So there's the envelope via airmail. You know, I certainly remember writing airmail on letters in the 90s. And then on the upper left-hand corner, it says the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, very official. But on top of that is a sort of hastily handwritten name, Luchheim, which is what her last name was at the time. So there's this layering of the personal and the intimate that's signaling to Eero that she actually put her hand into this document, right? That he's going to get a letter from the New York Times, but it's actually from her. And this sort of starts my interest in the personal layering on top of the professional. And here we really see a visual indication of that. Very helpfully, the dates are there. They did not like to date their correspondences to each other. So in the book, I have a lot of I really had to kind of piece together, right? They have a letter. I think it's before this next letter. They say things like in my last letter. So there's a lot of kind of puzzle solving energy. And so when they dated, it was very, very helpful. Here she says, Saarinen and Associates, Bloomfield Hills. That's probably kind of the official address. And then she says, Mr. Eero Saarinen. I think that the Mr. is kind of flirty. I think she's like, I respect you, right? She just calls herself Luchheim. She calls him Mr. Eero Saarinen. I read into that a little bit of flirtation, a little bit of like, I'm going to treat you like a serious man and call you Mr. Eero Saarinen. So this is the letter. And again, I undertake sort of a similar analysis of it, right? So it's typed, Dear Eero, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Dear Eero, I guess that submitting an article to an editor is like showing the design for a building. So she's immediately relating to him. She's saying, you know, we have actually similar sort of projects. We work in similar fields. She was kind of starting this process that I define as like applying for a job. I mean, she really wanted to work with him, and she is already starting to kind of say, listen, I understand your life. You can understand mine a little bit, but I'm really here for you. And then she says, I shouldn't let you see all this, but why not? These are my only carbons, so please, please preserve them and return them. Also, will you check on the age at which you entered the Swedish newspaper competition? Right. So again, there's this slippage constantly between the personal and the intimate, and then removing and being more distant and professional. You know, the period during which your father was director at Cranbrook. And then you see his responses. So at the top, he writes, would like Lacey and Barr mentioned as partners and associates. Written in this kind of, I mean, I wish I knew what material. It seems like a very thick pencil. Eric 10, Susie 8, you can see that's written in a different color. It's written in a different pen. So this is a document that Eero has actually engaged with multiple times. She signs it, sincerely yours, Aileen, in red. So there's a lot going on in this single document. And part of what I did in my book was to do kind of this level of analysis with a lot of different documents to sort of build up this argument about, again, this iterative relationship between the visual and the narrative, the personal and the professional. My book is really about what happens when two things that you think are different meet and come together and build a third thing, which is basically falling in love, right? Falling in love is just two separate things meeting and coming together and building a third thing. So there's a lot of letters like this. I read all of them. It was the best, 6 years of my life. So I read all of them so that you don't have to slog through all of them. But she sends him the only copy of the article, which is a tremendous show of trust. And again, as a working journalist, strikes fear into my heart. I can't even imagine doing that. Here's another example of this birthday card, which was a very, very long visually really fascinating card. And there's more images of it in the book. And she says, I must end. So this reaches you on August 20th when you will be 43. And I hope it is a very happy birthday and the beginning of a marvelously happy year. Many birthdays to come, I will be with you as your wife. So again, he was still married. But they started this kind of conversation about being married in some sense, being spiritually married. They developed this really fascinating conceit called brackets, and they would write letters to each other. And there would be this sort of professional level. And then that was just, dates, names, fact check. Then there was the ideas level where she would say, I want to give you some advice about this project, or here's what I think you should do. And then there was the sort of explicit personal level where they knew that he was married. They knew that they weren't yet married. And then there was brackets off. And I got really interested in this idea of brackets, which was sort of this shared narrative world that they co-created in which they acted as though they were married. They would talk about a future in which they would get married. They would talk about potentially having a child. And they would sort of create this world of future planning freedom that they didn't normally exist in. And so this document is written with those brackets off, right? Where she says, I will be with you as your wife. You can see in the heart, there's an E and an A, which is a little icon that I believe Eero came up with that shows, they really kind of wanted to like merge and become one. They did end up getting together. He really waffled on leaving his wife, Lily Swan, a sculptor. I mean, he was really kind of torn up about it. But he ended up, Aline had been divorced, I think. No, only once. Aline had been divorced from Joseph Luchheim, who was an industrialist, and she had 2 children, as did Eero. So she kind of walked him through what it would be like to get divorced. There's lots of letters where he's like, I don't know, the kids, and what will Lily say? And, Lily's been so great. And one of the really, it's caustic and it's tragic and it's funny and it's understandable is that Aline actually wrote into the New York Times story that Eero was married to Lily, but that it was clear that his work would always come first. And so she was using, her public position to kind of point out to Eero, you aren't that into your wife. Which may or may not have been true. There aren't documents that actually say how into his wife he was. There are documents that are letters that he wrote to his psychiatrist where he talks about the potential upsides of being married to somebody who isn't Lily and how many candidates there actually are. So one of the candidates was Astrid Sampe, this textile designer. This was before he met Aline, but we kind of can put together a little bit of a picture, which is that Eero was really a careerist, which I say sort of neutrally. I mean, I think that's a pejorative term sometimes, but I think, good for him. He knew what he wanted. But it's clear that when he met Aline, his mind was open to possibly leaving Lily. So Aline didn't come and pluck a happily married man from his very fulfilling family life. Whether any family life would have been fulfilling, I think kind of remains to be seen. And certainly I don't think that his life with Aline was any less tortured ultimately than his life with Lily. But this is kind of the development of their relationship. And she would frequently do these cards that attempted to encapsulate their history, that demonstrated, what they had been through, what they were going to be through. And I just think it's these like glittery little stars everywhere. I mean, it's so cute. It's so cute. And also it's this very sort of revolutionary historical document at the same time, which I love. I love that this document withstands sort of these multiple layers of analysis. And I believe it does, having analyzed it thoroughly. So this is the 2 of them. This is Aline and Eero sitting in, of course, the famous womb chair. He was a big fan of Florence Knoll, who everybody called Shu. And so they got the womb share into production. This is them at a party. I've never paid attention to the other three people. So I think this is great. The couple standing behind and smoking, and then this woman looking at them. But they're clearly engaged with each other. They're having a great time. And this is sort of an example of their very rich and very vibrant social life. And also the way, I think, interestingly, that they continue to be oriented towards each other. They were very... So once they got together, she moved to Bloomfield Hills. She convinced him to divorce Lily. She moved to Bloomfield Hills, and she took on a job as head of information services, which I think is also a really interesting title. It appears neutral in a way. So her sort of myth is that she's just, she's just neutrally going to give you information. And a big part of the book's argument is that there is, no such thing as neutral information. There's no such thing as neutral media, that all the media that we consume, has been very heavily modulated by these sort of actors, by these figures of whom Aileen was the first. And so she's really ensconced there. And she took over managing all of his public reputation. She took over managing everything from sending photography to magazines, which now we do via Dropbox. We're just like, here's the link. But in 1953, 54, 55, she would have to send actual photographs to magazines. And one of the great things that she did, and that I really extensively get into, is she would use being a woman at the time and being his wife almost to sort of give her cover for actually being an incredibly astute professional. And so she would write letters to people like Douglas Haskell, who's the editor-in-chief of Architectural Forum, and Cranston Jones, who is an editor of Architectural Record. And she would sort of imply that she didn't really know what was going on, that she, everything was chaotic, that all the materials were a mess, that she couldn't find anything. She referred to herself as an eager beaver. She talked about chewing her pencils with anxiety. She did all these things that sort of performed a lack of professionalism, which of course is a very coded term. But she would do this, I think, to sort of really disarm her interlocutor. So she would sort of make them think that she didn't really know what was going on and therefore couldn't possibly be manipulating them. And in the meantime, when we look at all these letters right next to each other, as I do, we see that she's sort of offering a project to one person, keeping it back from another. This was also right around when the exclusive started to be developed. So architectural magazines now, you might notice you never see a house in multiple magazines, right? You would never see a house in Architectural Digest and in Dwell magazine because they compete with each other. And so managing an exclusive is a really big part of what publicists do, is they decide where something should go. We're constantly kind of doing math and figuring out like, okay, it has a 70% chance of landing here and a 50% chance of landing here. But if it does land here, that'll be 100% better for the client. So there's a lot of kind of math that goes into everything and into then maintaining those relationships. Because if you are friends, as she was with Douglas Haskell and Cranston Jones, they're competing with each other. She needs to keep both of them kind of on her side, reading her letters, responding to her, interested in promoting Eero. And so a big part of what she did was really to manage this very, very, very carefully and very skillfully by pretending that she really had no idea what was going on and was just like a helpful wife. And so that's one of the, I think, most interesting things about studying her, is that she, I argue, is the person who really professionalized this role. So now in 2023, any architecture firm that you ever see in a magazine has a publicist. Sometimes those publicists are in-house. A lot of times they're external. I'm a publicist, so I have a number of clients and I place their work for publication. And it's a job. It's just a regular job. There's a code for it. When I file my taxes, when I get my business insurance, there's a code that says publicist. It's a very, very understood professional role. Publicists certainly existed before Aileen in other industries, but she's really the first person to manage publicity around buildings, and to think about disseminating buildings, to think about how to talk about them and how to write about them. And that's really the crux of my book. And that's the crux of the academic argument, is that historians have, usually architectural historians have seen magazines and they've used them as kind of almost neutral indicators of somebody's fame, right? So if they see somebody on the cover of Time magazine, for instance, as he was in 1956, the assumption would be, well, that's because his work was worthy of being in Time magazine. He was sort of found by the editors of Time. He was found by writers Um, and he, it was because of merit. And my contention is, yes, you need merit, of course. And he was put into time by his publicist slash wife, Aline. So it's also amazing that they used to put architects on the cover of Time. There was a very funny sort of viral TikTok of somebody asking a bunch of stars on the red carpet if they'd ever heard of Frank Gehry, and one person had heard of Frank Gehry. So architects are no longer gracing the cover of Time. But this is a example of one of her sort of most amazing placements. It was a long profile, and he really, in the story, I think you can see the traces of her influence. So one of the things that I did is I compared the press before her and the press after her. And before her, most of the stories emphasized very sort of factual pieces of information, right? So this auditorium is this many feet long and this many feet high, and it is made out of these materials. This project is made out of this, and it sits here. With the Time magazine profile, they started talking about TWA, which was in design. This is the TWA terminal at JFK, which recently reopened as like a hangout zone slash hotel lobby slash restaurant slash exhibition space. And there's this anecdote in the Time magazine story where they're sitting at breakfast and he picks up a grapefruit and he looks at it and he turns it over and he says, this is a building. And I know that Eero Saarinen was not an architect who was actually inspired by the shape of a grapefruit. He, like I said, was much more interested in these sort of internal, humanistic, theoretical, historical issues. But Aline understood that architecture could seem really esoteric, really kind of hard to understand, that people might not really want to read an article about an architect thinking about these like deeply esoteric issues, but they would be really interested in an architect talking about how he was inspired at breakfast by a grapefruit. And so this article, I think, really demonstrates the way in which she introduced narrative into architectural production, something that now, I feel like now storytelling is like such a big thing. Everybody's very interested in storytelling. People sell storytelling. You can make a lot of money, implying that you're very good at storytelling and being good at it. And this is really one of the sort of earliest examples of that in the world of architecture. So this is the TWA terminal. I don't know how much it looks like a grapefruit. There was a lot of discussion about it looking like a bird, which I'll get into. But I think this is a sort of incredible historical document. And, I'd seen so many images of this building, all of them from post 1962 when it opened. And I remember seeing it in person for the first time, actually on a tour when I was a journalist. So this is like many, many, many years ago. Rockwell Group had done the interiors of the JetBlue terminal along with Gensler, the new Terminal 5, then new Terminal 5. And we went on this tour, and I remember seeing this terminal, which from my vantage point was small. It was low to the ground. It was not very impressive. Whereas when you look at this image and you sort of place yourself there and you look at it, just imagine being in 1962 and you see this building. And it's like, you've never seen a building like this before. It doesn't make any sense how it stands up. It doesn't make any sense how it works. It's hard to figure out where the circulation is and what's actually going on. And so it was a really, really dramatically new and novel building at the time. And part of what I'm really interested in is how we look at buildings. One of the things that I teach, so I teach at Columbia, I teach in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I also teach undergraduates at Bard College. Hopefully going to start teaching in LA soon. But one of the things that I always ask my students to do on the first day is we go outside and we look at a building. And this can be anything from undergrads who are just taking this course to like get a requirement out of the way to, third year MArch students who are really committed to a career in architecture. And I have found that universally, it is very hard for people to tell me what they're looking at, because either they're so worried that they're going to get it wrong, that there's some right answer, or they jump right to interpretation. So recently at Avery Library, I took my students, where the architecture department is at Columbia, I took my students outside and I said, okay, describe this building to me. And they said, well, it's about power and it's about, control and it's about education. And I said, okay, well, what makes you think that? And we started looking at the column height and the size of the windows and the placement of the windows and the stairs going up and the front door. And we started investigating all of that. And that, I think, is a really important skill that there are some of us who are cultivating, but it's also a skill that doesn't come out of nowhere. And so, again, one of the things that she really facilitated and introduced was this sort of sophistication in writing about architecture and thinking about architecture, and also an accessibility. And that is one of the things that sort of my career has been devoted to, is making architectural writing accessible. I try to make it interesting. I try to make it narrative, right? I really care about architecture. I really care about the built environment. And it seems like it still is sort of siloed. It's over here. It's kind of for other people. But I think an image like this kind of reminds us that there is a moment of encounter between the person and the building, where the building is surprising, where the building is something that they've never seen before, that they've never even imagined before. And that is really one of, I think, Eero Saarinen's strengths, and why he is in the canon. The production of the canon is, of course, a very complicated issue, as it should be. But I think that this is a sort of incredible example of what he was able to imagine and do. So this is an article in the New York Times in, I think, 1958. Bones for a bird. To achieve the smooth, serene contours of a soaring bird in solid concrete, workmen are in the final stages of building a vastly complex mold of wood and steel. And so this is an image of some of the construction underway. And one of the things that I love about this is it says in the caption, not the result of a twister hitting a barn. These timbers are part of the form for a buttress that will help support the 6,000-ton roof. And so they sort of know, nobody has seen anything like this. This is wild, right? This looks like something that is going to fall apart. This looks bananas. Like, we have no idea what we're even looking at. We realize this looks like a totally destroyed building, but it's not. It's actually going to be the contours for a soaring bird. And so I have a chapter about TWA and about the way in which this bird analogy starts to take flight, for want of a better term. This idea of the bird is introduced. And actually, I will say, I wrote in the book that Aline had introduced it. And then somebody, I should know his name, somebody wrote a review, and he actually corrected me and said that actually it was a reporter who had come up with the bird idea, and Aline ran with it. And like, I did not want to accept this correction. I was like mortified. I was horrified. But there's something to be said for the sort of strange pleasure of having somebody take such a sort of intellectually rigorous approach to your work, that they correct you. And so now whenever I give presentations, I have to go by this accurate correction, which is that she did not introduce it, but she really ran with it. And she ran with it to the point that Eero actually got really sick of it. And in some of their later letters, their later conversations with each other, one of the things that was difficult about this book was that there were so many letters at the beginning of their relationship. And so it was very, very easy to reconstruct those first early years. But as time went on, she was living next to him. They were not writing each other letters, but they were occasionally communicating in office memos of varying levels of passive aggression, which was, I think, one of my favorite things. As I went through multiple relationships while writing this book, I was delighted to see that even a couple who were, drawing each other these sort of like glittery cards and professing their undying love for each other, at a certain point, she asked him to do something, and he said, "Is this not your department?" And she wrote back, "I do not have a crystal ball. You should answer this yourself." And I just thought, God, this is every conversation about, how I cannot read anybody else's mind. But going back to this bird idea, this was very clearly managed very well in the press. She really cemented this idea that it was a bird. And in one of those kind of slightly snippy letters that he wrote to her, he said, "I'm really so sick of this bird image." And so he was kind of getting over it a little bit. But she understood that if you have an idea that makes a building legible, then you should run with it. And that is kind of one of the other broader interests that I have is exploring how buildings come to mean something, how buildings communicate, how buildings make us feel some type of way. So I started writing about architecture when I was in architecture school. I went to a liberal arts school, so I don't have a B Arch. I have a BA, which is important only in sort of orienting me. So my approach to architecture was really steeped in literature, in history, in theory. It was not technical. I never learned how a building meets the ground. I never learned how to draw a roof. I didn't learn any of that, but I learned how to think about the built environment. And this image is of the interior of the TWA shortly after it opened. It was in an article in Forum called I Want to Catch the Excitement of the Trip. This is 1962. This is the dawn of the jet age. This is when flying was glamorous. This is when people, as you can see, you got dressed up to go on the airplane. It was a big deal to go on the plane. This is not like Spirit Airlines. This is not Southwest. This is not Ryanair. This is like you are going to have a really interesting time flying on TWA. And this building was closed for a really long time. It had fallen into disrepair and it opened fairly recently. It was refurbished. And it was so interesting to me to work on this building, to work on this interior, and to try to imagine myself in this space and then actually go and visit it. So, like I said, I was exposed to architecture as a very, very young child, was always very interested in architecture, went to architecture school, wanted to be an architect, and discovered to my great horror that I could not draw. I could not make models. I was just one of the worst students. And my professors were always like, what are you doing? Why are you here? You should major in English. Like, what is going on? But I loved architecture and I wanted to figure out why I felt a certain way in certain buildings. I'd visited Le Corbusier's Ronchamp in France and remember feeling, I was 12 years old. I was as secular as it gets. And I remember feeling some sort of presence of the mystical. And that was architecture. I mean, that just happened because of what Corbusier did with forms, with material, with light, with windows, with apertures, with a soaring roof that was also heavy. I mean, all of that was architecture and it produced the sort of effect in me. And so a lot of my work, I realized I should become an architecture critic if I couldn't become an architect, is really in investigating how do we feel in buildings and why do we feel that way in buildings. But when I went to TWA for the first time a couple of years ago, I was struck by actually how small it felt in the interior. And there's this really interesting kind of dissonance between the way that you feel when you walk in, and it is a little bit soaring, but then as soon as you get close to a wall, the walls turn into the ceiling and it feels very kind of close, and it's like it's not actually grand and it's not actually soaring, but it also sort of is. And so I was really, really interested in how does the organization of space actually make me feel either grand or compressed? Why does it make me feel nostalgic or sad or optimistic or all of these things? So that is yet another kind of through line of this book and of the rest of my work is, how does architecture make us feel some type of way? And I believe that it does. And I will like die on that hill 100%. So if you're ever in New York, I really encourage you to have a meal here. I had a really lovely celebratory dinner with my graduate school advisor right after the pandemic. I mean, ended once things kind of got back into motion. We had dinner here and looked at the concrete and looked at the curves and kind of imagined, what this must have been like when it opened. And very, very tragically, Eero died before it was finished. He died in 1961, and it opened in 1962. And I'll get into that a little bit. So back to our subject. This is them. They're married. I think this is just a lovely, lovely photo. She's looking at him. One of the things that I was really interested in and continue to be interested in is the way in which publicists, our job is to look adoringly at our client and then to tell him that he's a genius, and it's almost always him still. Male architects still outnumber female architects by a factor of a lot. But she's looking at him and he's sort of looking off into the glorious distance. And this is right after they were actually married in 1954. They got very quietly married. And I just love this picture. I mean, they're really in love. And, seeing the later it's an odd thing also to be a historian. It's odd to be a historian for many reasons, but one of them is that I just always know how the story ends. You know, I knew that he died at the end when I started reading everything, and still there is a sort of way in which when I'm in the archive, when I'm looking at this material, you know, it does come alive for me. It does begin to produce this sort of cinematic feeling that I'm there, that I'm with them, that I'm hearing them, that I'm reading them, that I'm sort of inside their minds. And that's part of what I really tried to do with the book, is really make it feel like this sort of cinematic story where you're going along with them as they fall in love, and you're seeing everything. And that really propelled a lot of the sort of more granular, you know, architectural theoretical investigations. And it just shows love and connection, and it's great. So he died in 1961, very, very suddenly. He had literally 2 weeks' notice. He started feeling unwell. He went to the doctor, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and he died 2 weeks later. And what was sort of triply tragic is that Aline had started to feel kind of stifled by having to work only for him. She was asked to write a book about him before anybody knew he was sick, before anybody knew he was dying. And she said, you know, she wrote back, "I'm really not interested in that project." So my last chapter, the title is "I'm really not interested in that project." And she said, "I would like to confine my interest to those outside the office," which I think is a fascinating line, where she says, "I would like to confine," which is such a strong word and sort of implies it's just going to keep things close. But she's actually saying outside the office. She really missed her life as a freelance journalist. I think that she missed being able to think about things besides her husband's career. Um, and she was really on her way to writing about, she was working on another book project with Random House. After he died, she went on TV. So there's a generation of people that remember seeing her on TV, but she really wanted to kind of move on. And then he died, and she had to both personally grieve and professionally manage his office. And so that's one of the, again, the sort of really interesting moments in this slippage and relationship between the personal and the professional. She sent out a number of cables to, you know, Oliver Alto, to a number of other architects. And she just said, you know, Eero died suddenly after a short illness, heartbroken, Aline. And I'm really interested in that sort of ability to perform wifely grief. And then also she had to write to the people who were building TWA, and she had to say, you know, the office is going to be fine. And she really threw herself back into the office. She saw everything through. They were in the middle of moving to New Haven. She managed all of that. Kevin Roche and John Dinkaloo, who ended up forming their own office, they were principals there. And she really, you know, she was like on her way out, and then he died. And so she was brought back in. And one of the things that she did is she finished his book called Eero Saarinen on his work. And of course, we know that it was actually Aline Saarinen on Eero's work. And so again, there's this really interesting kind of doubling, or there's this, it's almost a disavowal. I think similarly to her sort of pretending to just be, you know, like a scatterbrained, helpful wife, as she publishes this book, it's her words on his work. And there are documents that show, you know, he'd written some of the material, but she had edited over it. And so she's like in her grief, but also ambivalent, because she had wanted to not work on him anymore. And now he was dead, but she had to work on him. But also, you know, it was just kind of a very like complicated stew, very confusing soup of a time. But she chose to prioritize, you know, the health of the office and also the health of his legacy. And so she finished this book. And I think that's kind of the final, you know, I sort of trace her influence, and it starts with, she writes about him and she defines him. Her article was called Now Saarinen and the Sun, and it was very clear that he was overtaking Eliel as fame, in fame, right? So she sort of puts him on the map in this very specific way. Then she starts influencing him in these other ways. She makes suggestions. She thinks about his career, right? So they're kind of like more in dialogue. Then she starts actually managing his career, managing his public presentation, but he's still really the one who's calling the shots. And then this final sort of capstone is her writing Eero Saarinen on his work, and it actually being her work. And I thought that that was a fascinating arc to trace. I think that relationally, there is often this sort of like merging and even takeover, and it's very important not to have a full takeover. But this was, obviously a really extreme version of that. But I just thought, what a sort of perfect way of demonstrating this. So there's this image. She is holding this book, which has him on the cover, looking at a model. She's holding his work. She's holding him. She's in, I'm sure she's still in a grief process. And she's also just like out there and she's working for him, her best client, even after he died. So this has been a sort of small, not too short, but a little bit short kind of encapsulation of this story. I obviously had no historical distance when I was writing this book. I just think that like this one image is just so great. I returned to it every time I got a little bit, bored or overwhelmed. And I just thought, I want to do right by this person. An original draft was called What Would Aline Do? Because I didn't really get into this here, but I do write about my own experiences working as a publicist. And there were many times where I was in a pickle. And I would think, okay, well, how would Aline get out of this pickle? What would she do? And I would basically co-opt her methods before the 21st century. So she says, everything is a mess. I don't know where the photos are. And I would say, oh, my Dropbox is down and my email server was broken and all of that. And sort of, adopted for better or worse some of her methods. But that's it. I'm really, really delighted to have gotten to share this with you. And I hope that there are questions. I love questions. And Jillian, if you are here, I will turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you. This was amazing. I learned so much. I have been taking my own notes. So I do have a few questions for you myself. Anyone in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them either in the chat or the Q&A function. So I just wanted to, one of my first questions was kind of, how did you get into this work and how did you come across a story? Because this seems like such a niche thing. And I feel like at the end there, when you had mentioned, wanting to know why you felt a certain way in certain buildings and how buildings communicate and how they can start to mean something, it kind of like started to make sense to me of how like this, how you're interacting with the story. But I would love to know a little bit more about kind of, how you got started or again, how you came across this story.
Yeah. So, there's like a couple different origin points. But broadly speaking, so I graduated with a degree in architecture. I moved to New York. I became an architecture critic, architectural journalist. It was great. It was like 2003. Magazines were, they had money. I was sent all over the world. And I sort of realized that my fantasy had been I would move to New York and I would see a building and I would write about it. And somebody would say, this is amazing. I'll publish, 20,000 words. And I realized that there was actually this really entrenched ecosystem in which there was a publicist. And I always thought that the publicists were doing me favors because they would take me out for breakfast and then they would say, oh, I have this project and let me send you these images and maybe you could take it to Wallpaper Magazine. And I was like, God, they really love me. This is so amazing. Like, wow, they're buying me breakfast. Like, this is so great. And they tell me how smart I am all the time. And like, of course I'll take this to Wallpaper Magazine. And I was like, man, I'm getting free breakfast and I'm getting money to write about architecture. This is amazing. And just sort of assumed that this was, how it had always been and how it worked. And then I went to grad school after the recession. I did what every smart person, what many smart people do. And I was like, hid in grad school. And I remember very clearly being in a seminar in my first year. And there was a project by Perkins and Will, the Ambani residence in Mumbai, which is like the world's most expensive single family house designed by Perkins and Will. And the student was giving a presentation on the house. And she said, well, there's only one rendering online. And so she made this whole argument about there only being one rendering. And I knew that the reason that there was one rendering was that the project was under embargo, that there was an exclusive that had been negotiated by a publicist. It was probably going to go to the New York Times or the New Yorker. I think it went to the New Yorker. And I was like, wait, this person is missing this like very crucial piece of information. And then I realized that all of my professors were missing that piece of information. I was looking at how architectural history was done. And I was like, wait a second, nobody knows that there are publicists. And I think that there is this kind of idea that publicity is like inappropriate, right? Or it's not a serious topic,
Yeah.
publicity and PR, like that's just somebody sending out a press release. And so I kind of wanted to say like, hey, everybody's kind of missing this thing. So that was like one strand that I was kind of holding in my head. And my master's thesis was about an article in Architectural Digest in 1971. So I was kind of interested in media. And then like I said, I was like in this new relationship, and it was like Valentine's Day. And I found an article by Alex Lang, this great architecture critic and design observer. And it was something like, look at these adorable love letters between Eero Saarinen and Aline Saarinen. And I read them and I thought, oh my God, this is so great. And I saw that they were digitized by the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. And I started reading them and I was like, wait, these letters are showing how the public, like, I sort of put it together. And a lot of it was really a hunch. I mean, because there was so much documentation and the archive was so extensive, but I just had to believe, like, I will find the proof. And as I say in the book, I never find the smoking gun, right? I mean, Kevin Roche did say Aline Saarinen was our publicist. So I was like, okay, I got it. But a lot of it was sort of contextual. I had to kind of put it together. I had to say, based on all these things that I know and have found out, this is my argument. But that was really how I got into it. And then while I was working on my dissertation, I got asked by a firm to help them with their website copy. And then they said, well, actually, could you do marketing for us? And I said, well, I can't do marketing, but I could maybe help you get published. And then I sort of built this like very successful boutique PR agency, which I wound down during the pandemic, and then I just wound back up again. So I was also doing this work and thinking about it. And that's always my kind of like, when architects are like, why would I hire you? I'm like, well, I literally wrote the book about this. Like, I'm the one person who literally wrote the book on this. So, you can go with anybody, but I wrote the book on it. So,
I mean, that's a great answer to have. Yeah.
It's good. It's good. It feels good. There was a moment before the book came out and I had just gotten my degree. I was walking around the streets of New York City and I really felt sort of what it means to get a PhD. And I thought, God, if I get hit by a car, all this knowledge, I'm the only person who has all this. And now the book is out. So now, my life is a little less valuable.
Oh, goodness. Great. Okay. And we have a question in the chat and from Sandy. Sandy, you and I must be sharing some kind of wavelength here because I also had the same question. Did Eero ever design furniture or was he strictly an architect?
He did design furniture. So there's the famous, there's the womb chair, and then there's the Saarinen tulip table. There are so many copies of the tulip table now, but it's round and it has a sort of fluted base, and it's white, and it's great. It's lovely. I always want to have one, but they're too expensive and I can't get a copy. So, and I'm sure he designed more furniture. I mean, one of the sort of terrible things that I realized is I am a Aline Saarinen scholar, not a Saarinen scholar. So I really know about him kind of in this period through her, but there's somebody who knows much more about Eero's furniture. And I can try to track that person down, but I'm sure that they exist. But yes, broadly speaking, he did do furniture.
Gotcha. Okay, wonderful. And then another question I have, what was your favorite part about writing this book, or something that you learned that kind of stuck with you, or your favorite anecdote that you picked up?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think so. I'll answer. I mean, there's sort of two questions in that one question. So one is like, what's my favorite part, and what's my favorite anecdote? My favorite part was really working with an amazing editor at Princeton University Press who I met at the Society for Architectural Historians. I was like going through a divorce. I was in like the early stages of a divorce. I was out of my mind. I was like fully bananas. And I dragged myself to the SAH in, I think, Providence. And I'm like moping around and I'm obsessed because my like rebound hasn't texted me back. And I'm just like losing it. And I meet Michelle Comey and I like have just enough wherewithal to say, I'm just finishing my degree. I work on the Saarinen. And she said, I love the Saarinen. Send me an email. And I sent her an email about my project and she just wanted to do it. And that level of commitment was so incredible. We went through, it wasn't always a sort of hybrid book. It started out as just a straight academic book. And then I had one page where I said, well, I'm a design journalist and a publicist, so, trust me on this. And she sent it out for review, and a reviewer said, I actually want to hear more about, the author's sort of experiences working as a publicist. And I remember having this conversation with Michelle and just saying, like, I don't know what to do. What should I do? And she said, well, because I'd been so in academia, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for like new formats. I was really taught to just like do the thing. My advisor would always say, we know you can do all these experimental performance things, but just do a regular dissertation. And so I was kind of in that mindset. And especially with a press like Princeton, I was like, oh God, like they're so, it's going to have to be like really serious. And it is. And Michelle said, just write the book that you would write if you had no guardrails, if you had no brackets. And that was an incredible experience to be sort of entrusted with this. And of course, that made me work so much harder at like the boring parts because of that faith. So I really learned like having an editor who sees sort of the totality of my work. And also I want to say like she understood the sort of the intellectual motivations behind self-disclosure. So the anecdote that I just told you about getting divorced is like exactly what Aline would have done, where it's like you just sort of tell a story and you sort of try to, disarm your listener, and then so it's like she was really interested in like how all of that kind of fit together. And then my favorite anecdote from the book is probably, or my favorite moment from the book, I think it's really the case history of a romance birthday card that I showed a couple images of. I mean, just the way in which Aline narrated her experience of them falling in love. And one of the other things I'm really interested in my other work is like how we narrate ourselves, how we tell stories about ourselves, what it means to produce an autobiography, what it means to produce a memoir, and sort of her commitment to trying to encapsulate and formalize, this very sort of messy history through images and through text. I just thought was great. I was like, what a like, I mean, so thirsty, for his love, which was great. And so I think that, the case history of a romance is really like, that just does it for me,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are sadly out of time today. This was amazing. Eva, thank you so much for being here. Huge thank you from the Nordic Museum. I will point out, Sandy said her sister has an original tulip table and 4 chairs that she bought from a friend.
Wow.
So I will put good vibes out there for you so you can find your own.
Thank you.
Table. You're welcome. But thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, this is a recorded session, so we will have this up on our website shortly in about a week. And we hope to see you at the Nordic Museum very soon.
Thank you so
everybody.
much. Bye.